Welcome everyone. Welcome to my the third installment of my classes introducing this book that I was so excited to write. Why Abraham Murdered Isaac: The First Stories of the Bible Revealed. This is the month leading into my the official publication. And I have more talks on this. I'm very, this is an exciting moment for me to do something popular, and I hope you'll be with me on this journey. So in previous talks, I talked about, like, the book is an autobiography, why, how I came to write this kind of book. And I wanted to focus now on the book itself, on what I wrote. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on what is biblical criticism. I'm going to show excerpts from my book, and how my book, why specifically my book, how it introduces biblical criticism, and then I offer throughout the book kind of a manual for dummies on biblical criticism, just in layman's language, and I'm going to bring excerpts on the nuts and bolts, and then I'm going to take an example, the most famous example, why Abraham murdered Isaac, and why that's important as a story. And how do I show that Abraham murdered Isaac? According to the original version of the story in today's Bible, Abraham did not murder Isaac. And then what's most interesting to me is the why Abraham did that, and which is a question that's baffled philosophers for a very long time. And then we'll conclude. So that is the basic structure. We're not a very large group. I'm going to speak. If you have questions, if I come to a natural pause, you can unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, you can put your question in the chat, and I will address it as soon as I see it. I'm going to have the chat up, so I'll be able to see it right away. And there'll be frequent pauses for questions. I'm going to try to make this as clear as possible. Okay, so I'm going to start with, without further ado, what is biblical criticism? What is Bible criticism? So it's not like critiquing a film. It's not like saying, it's not like saying, offering constructive criticism on a paper that somebody has written. Those are different acts of criticism, and they imply actual criticism, saying you have to improve this, you have to, you should delete this. This is not well formulated. Things of that nature. That's what criticism in the more colloquial sense is. In spoken English. When we're talking about academia, when we're talking about how biblical criticism as an academic discipline, what we're talking about is something very different. It's a part of a type of academic exploration that's like literary criticism. It's a type of analysis. It's looking at it through critical lenses, not making any, through the scientific method, as it were. Now, it's not the same methods that you will find in the hard sciences or even in the social sciences, but still, the humanities tries to adhere to certain methodologies, some more rigorous than others, and so that is what biblical criticism is about. It's that sort of analysis. What's specifically biblical criticism, as opposed to, say, literary criticism, as opposed to other forms of other disciplines that deal with literature? So I'm going to that's the first thing that I have to deal with, because people are not familiar with that coming in, and it's it's what I am doing. I'm coming at my at the story through the lens of biblical criticism, so I have to explain what I'm doing. And so I'm going to read you excerpts from my introduction, and I will then I'll put it up on the screen, and then I'll pause and explain, and wait for some questions as well. So this is from the preface. Okay, so the first premise of biblical criticism is that God didn't write the Bible. Now, that might seem very obvious to the particular audience I have here, since we're an audience of secular humanists for the most part. So but it is something that one has to state, because part of the religious belief system of Jews and Christians is that God is responsible for a good deal of the writing of the Bible, and through dictation or through divine inspiration, um, and it's very necessary to and that is believed by a lot of people, and so it's necessary to state right off the bat that that is what our assumptions are coming in. Divinities do not write texts, as far as we can ascertain. Only human beings write texts. So so as I say here, without delving into theology, every book I know was written by a human being, and it's a common sense assumption that that's the same is true for the Hebrew Bible. So it is a special book. It's an ancient book and important to many people. It's a special book, and that's the reason I study it. But it was written by fallible human beings, so we have to assume that coming in. So yes, I do belabor the point. I speak here in kind of quasi-dialogue. I do belabor the point because it's an important point to make. So, but who wrote the Bible then? So that's one of the important questions that biblical critics try to answer, is who wrote the Bible when. So the thing is no one knows who wrote the Bible. But people have ventured educated and less educated guesses, and guesses that are inspired by that are religiously motivated, and other guesses. There's the Bible is a very big book. I'm interested in what is referred to as the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, and their authorship of other books is also interesting. But it's named the 5 books of Moses, and spoiler alert, it wasn't Moses who wrote the Bible either. He was a human being. He is a human figure. Whether he was actually a human being that existed is another question that I'm very happy to explore. But it can't. It's very unlikely that the figure Moses wrote the Bible. Okay. So of course, why is it impossible? And this comes now to one of the other important questions that biblical criticism tries to answer, and that's the when. When was the Hebrew Bible written? So Moses, if we follow biblical chronology, and we're under no obligation to do so, Moses would have lived at sometime 1400 before the Common Era. So about 3,400 years ago. But even the most conservative Bible critics, religious scholars are another piece of this. They will date the Hebrew Bible earlier, but I'm talking about Bible critics, people who engage, who agree to some of my to some of the axioms that I stated, that human beings wrote the Bible. They will. They won't. Even the most conservative of them won't say that the Bible was written before 1000 BCE. That's already a gap of 300 or 400 years. And I personally think, and a lot of scholars, I'm in a middle median position on this among Bible scholars. I think it was really the process of composition started around 750 BCE. So we're talking about 650 years after Moses lived. so we see, it's really, you know, the gap here is too big, for Moses to have been related to the writing process. It's just, uh, think of the game. One of the examples Bible critics often love to give is like the game we play as kids, where the broken telephone, where you whisper something into someone's ear and see what happens to the message that you whisper by the end of the chain. And what was fun about it was never the same message. You never got it was never you never heard the same thing that you started off with. And that is actually, a very apt over here, a very apt way of thinking about this. The reliability of anything 650 years old, through oral tradition, is just really, really low. What could have, there's not a lot that could be preserved reliably in a mostly oral culture for 650 years. Not, it's always possible. We in the humanities deal with possibilities often and not certainties, but it's highly unlikely. But why do I say that the Hebrew Bible was written, around like say 750 or something, that it started, that's when the composition started? I would say there are a lot of reasons. My favorite one has to do with camels. Um, Camels, are very ubiquitous in the Middle East, in desert cultures, um, but they were only domesticated fairly late in the game. They were only really domesticated in the first millennium BCE, meaning sometime in those 1,000 years. But so it can't really have and there's stories about camels, a number of them, and especially in the book of Genesis, but elsewhere too. And so when you have domesticated camels, it talks about an experience of the world that wasn't really present in 13 or 1400 BCE. So the Hebrew Bible had to have been, the composition had to have started much later. That's one of the reasons. There are many, many other reasons, but I'm not here to deliver a class on an introduction to biblical criticism. If Moses didn't write, then who did? So no one knows, because no one knows when. So if you don't know when, you can't really know who. But we can know. We can kind of dig at the identity of particular authors. And what we know for sure, without a shred of doubt, is that more than one person participated in the composition of these books, and that is, another of the big, of the big questions that is explored. How many voices do you find in the 5 books of Moses? You find 5 voices? Do you find 10 voices? Do you find 40 voices? Scholars disagree on this, but Bible critics are fairly unanimous on multiple authorship of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, that more than one person wrote it. And the reason for that is there are a number of reasons. The way you figure that more than one person wrote it is that there are plenty of contradictions. That there's where it says one thing, and then 5 verses later, 3 chapters later, it implies the opposite. You see one style of writing, and then 5 chapters later, or the same chapter, you see a completely different style of writing. You see multiple repetitions of stories where the repetition doesn't make sense, where there's not a good reason for repetition. So those are some of the reasons that we think the Bible scholars are absolutely sure that there are multiple people writing it. So here, I just to illustrate it, on the face of it, writing in different styles doesn't necessarily mean that multiple people wrote it. For example, like I write abstruse Hebrew poetry, memoirs no one reads, origami books, and academic scholarship. One person can write all kinds of things. But the critical difference is that each of the books I write is its own separate work. They are not all mashed up in a literary potpourri. So that's part of the reason, we're assuming that multiple people wrote it. It's very unlikely that those styles coexist easily. We find this, just to give an example, in the course of a 3-chapter span in Exodus, you'll find 2 different versions of the laws of Passover: the gripping account of how Israel left Egypt, a poetic song to God, and a journey log. It's very difficult to attribute all those styles of writing to one person. One of the questions that is very relevant for writing this book is, so maybe one person didn't write it, but why should we care? Like, what does it matter to us? Why am I presenting on this book? Why did I write it? Why am I interested? And there are many reasons. I've talked about them a little. I've talked about them a lot already in the 2 previous talks. But I'm not as interested in later authors. I've always been very interested in the first layers of writing, the first person and the first specifically guy who wrote, who contributed to the authorship of the 5 books of Moses, the original story. And the reason I'm interested in it is because the stories in the original version are so very different than the stories that you see in today's Bible. They're just like totally they've totally shifted. Today's Bible has shifted. The original Bible is the original Bible. So I'm not, the promise that I give people in the introduction is that I'm not promising people that they will be convinced by my arguments, but it's the only promise I can give is that these are versions of stories that people have never heard before, and it's from the dawn of Jewish history. Meaning, these are the first records, and I'm digging deep into the first layer of the first records. So that's why it's interesting, for even people who are very very knowledgeable about the Hebrew Bible don't know this, don't know. Through looking at this kind of book can reevaluate their notions about what the Hebrew Bible is, and how it and its connection to modern religious discourse. Okay, let me stop the share for a second, and if you have any questions right now, you're invited to either raise your hand or unmute yourself. Yes, Isabel.
So there are these multiple versions of the same story that got written by like somebody who's more into numbers and rules and laws, and other ones that are more into like the moral behind the story or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, the book was codified as this is the official. Why didn't those people, whoever did that, make the effort to get some consistency? Because it seems much less credible to anybody looking at it when the same story is told 5 chapters later than it was already given. It's just confusing, and like it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, and that's true. That's a question often asked of Bible critics, like, why didn't one of the later editors smooth over the inconsistencies that he had with an earlier participant? And so there are a number of questions. So it's clear that they did not. So we have to contend with that. And it seems like earlier ancient authors, not just based on our knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, but based on our, looking at other ancient texts, they were just not as bothered with inconsistency as we are. Like with repetition, with Okay, it was a good story. Let me tell it again in another version. Okay, it didn't really work with that particular version, but okay, it wasn't so horribly inconsistent that that I can't suspend disbelief or something as I read. So there seems to have been that process seems to have been really alive and well, and we can tell that a lot of people, if you teach introductions to the Bible, are really shocked to find all these contradictions. Like they read the text, they assume coherence. Your assumption is coherence. So when you read it, you say, "Oh, that you try to make sense." Part of our mind is geared towards making sense of a story. So you try to read it, you make sense of it as you read, and so the inconsistencies are not as big of a deal even to modern readers that are not attuned to it, that I don't bother pointing it out to them. Oh, here's an inconsistency. Some people will find it on their own. Often people will not. Shirley, you had a question?
Yes. So you're referring to the original Bible as opposed to what we now have to what to the Bible is. So where did you find these alternate stories that you refer to as the original Bible?
So that's I'm going to get into that right away. That'll be the next stage of my talk. But in short, I take them right from the biblical text, meaning I isolate the earliest version from the biblical text itself. And take away the later layers from the biblical text itself to uncover the earliest version of the biblical text. It's all there in the Hebrew Bible. It's much shorter because I take away a lot of what was added later on. So part of what I'm going to talk about at the next stage of my talk is how I do this, like how I come to those kinds of conclusions. Yes, Elon.
So when they were writing it, first of all, it was common back then for other civilizations also to have inconsistent mythologies. I mean, Greek mythology.
Yeah.
Not the version.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But also, when they were writing this, were they writing this with the intention of being some sort of authoritative text, or was it just national narratives, something like that?
So I would say somewhere in between. Meaning, you have to understand that writing in the ancient world, especially writing in ancient Israel, was at that point very, very rare. So when you write something, it's not like today where I have 1,000 books in my house. It's writing a book. It was a huge, huge deal. So by the very act of writing a coherent story, that gives it a lot of authority. And so there, was it like total authority? Would this is the word of God and you can't right away? No, it wasn't. We're not speaking about canonization. That's something that happens a lot later. Very different process, very different cultural background. What we're talking about is the text has a lot of authority and importance. And that authority and importance informs how later people are going to treat the text, how editors are going to treat that subsequent text. And that's something I'm going to talk about very shortly. So part of what I do, this book actually can be used as a quasi primer to biblical criticism, and the reason is because I try to explain what I do. I try to explain the how you do biblical criticism, the nuts and bolts, because I have to be able to articulate the reasons for how I isolate the first version of this original Bible. So the hows are related very much to what I said before. There are a few ways we know that multiple authors participated in the composition of the biblical text, and I talked about different styles. I talked about repetitions. I talked about contradictions. I talked about inconsistencies. Those are the ways where in which we identify that there are multiple authors. It's also the ways in which we identify what the borders, the contours of the writing are. So that's the way I will identify the original text. I will say this, because this part contradicts one, because one part contradicts another, that part is later and that part is earlier. And I make that kind of determination, and then enough of that, I do that enough, and I enough times throughout my exploration, and I come up with a coherent storyline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do that. So I'm going to start with the notion of, let's see, let's do different styles first. Okay, wait, give me a second. I'm gonna bring it up. Okay. No, actually, let's start. Let's do it in order. The way the book is organized is into 5 sections. The heroes of the original Bible. There are 5 heroes in the original Bible: Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and a hero you probably some of you probably have not heard of, Balaam or Bilam. He's the 5th hero, and he's not properly Israelite. But Abraham may not be a properly Israelite either. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so cutting out the boring parts. Here, I try to make this very colloquial, even sometimes, amusingly colloquial sometimes. So what if I told you that with a few strokes of a pen, you can make the Bible into such an exciting story that you wouldn't want to put it down until you read the last page? Of course, it's exaggeration, but I have to draw people in. Bible scholars have known for many years that the most boring parts of the 5 books of Moses were actually added on by the ancient equivalent of accountants. All the lists of sacrifices, temple furniture, laws, intricate family lists, these were added by curmudgeonly priests. That's the ancient equivalent to an accountant. That's somebody who has a very organized mind, and so all of that material, which occupy, if you look at percentage-wise at the 5 books of Moses, those lists, sacrifices occupy like about 40% of the 5 books of Moses. So a giant percentage, and you can, with a few strokes of the pen, you can make a determination that was not part of the original Bible. That was added on later. So how do I come to that conclusion? So it's the racy stories of Abraham selling off his lovely wife Sarah to the highest bidder that came first. Why did okay? If the racy stories of the Bible were the only things your teacher taught you, they may have led you to a life of sin and enjoyment. So you don't learn that, and when you look at the Hebrew Bible, it's the stories that may grab you. But when you're in like a religious context and studying the Hebrew Bible, you don't necessarily you study the stories. You don't necessarily are not told that the other parts of the Hebrew Bible are secondary. You come to realize yourself that they're boring, but you don't realize that they're actually added on later. And teachers, even teachers in schools and in universities, don't really tell you. But there's a reason. There's a reason for what these priests were doing. So if you only had a story, this is here where I do a logical move over here. If you only had the lively, engaging story, that was the core, the original of the original Bible, it might have been a great story, but you wouldn't have actually been able to convince your readers, that it was the word of God, that it was so extraordinarily important to and such. And so part of what happened was priests, accountants, or whatever you want to call them, they got their hands on this first version, and they added lists, they added laws, they added all these sections with a lot of detail. And part of the way our mind works is that we're inclined to trust detail. We're inclined to trust exact figures. 49.7 is more trustworthy than around half, you know. And so lists and names and dates, if you have somebody who really, adds a lot of that to the text, we're more inclined to take the text as authoritative. If we didn't have all that, well, we'd have a great story, but we wouldn't necessarily accept it as authoritative. We'd accept it as a great story. And so, that's the logical reason why the priests were adding this material. Now, I haven't exactly explained, how I know that the priests added this material, but that has to do, with with a couple of the reasons I've stated before. The idea of different styles. It's like it's a markedly different style. We know that a different author wrote. We don't know, but we come to I would say a justifiable inference that someone else wrote it, and then we look at the narrative, the story, and we say, okay, well, what's the relationship between these two parts? What came first? Did the story come first in one style, or did the laws and these lists come first? And then we can make the kind of logical deduction, like I did. This is in very general terms, that it's the story that came first, and then the laws that were added to it onto it next. And the reason for that was to make it into an authoritative text. Okay, so let's now go to the next, the introduction to the next chapter. Okay, so here, Joe, what's in a name? So, a legitimate question that may have arisen even in the course of this talk is, am I pulling this out of a hat? Meaning, am I making it up as I go along? So one of the ways where you distinguish between the original Bible and what came afterwards is a distinction in style, saying things differently. And so I want to be a little more specific about that. So, every person prefers certain words or expressions over others. I, as a Canadian expat, say, excuse me, even when it's not my fault. This is something that's known about Canadians. A Brit might say, pardon me, and while others might say, while others say, I'm sorry, and there are certain people who will say nothing and push you harder. But the authors of the Bible are the same. So the author of the original Bible preferred certain words and expressions over others, and the first editor had different expressions that were used instead. So one of the most important distinctions is the distinction in the name of God. In this original Bible, in the first version, the name of God that is used is Elohim, and that's why often in biblical scholarship people refer to this to the original Bible, or to people don't agree with me that it's the original Bible, so the source as E. And the first editor's name for the divinity is Yahweh, and so that's one of the most important and basic distinctions that we have, a different use of name for the divinity. In one source it was Elohim, in another source it was Yahweh. But there are a lot of these. There's a lot of these different usages that you can tease out. So, for example, another one is Jacob and Israel, right? Jacob, the name for the third patriarch according to one source is Jacob, and according to another source it was Jacob and then changed into Israel and then was only Israel. And so that's another way to distinguish. And there are all kinds of these. There's Pharaoh. Sometimes Pharaoh is used. Sometimes the king of Egypt. And those are kind of like, it's 6 or half a dozen. What does it matter? No, it doesn't really matter. They mean, they can mean mostly the same thing, but it is a different style, a different way of talking, and there's a different idea behind behind Elohim. Elohim is an austere, uncommunicative deity. That's how he is. That's how the God character is depicted in the original Bible, whereas in the first editor's work, the divinity Yahweh that's a personal name, and he has a very personal relationship with Israelites. He gets very jealous. He needs validation, insecure. There's a lot of that going on with the divinity over there, and so you see each name has a different flavor, and that's true for other names as well. But that's one of the major distinctions that you have, and we have a fair number of those, and that's part of the way Bible critics will distinguish between the sources, the stories that they find in the Torah. Okay, so let me move on to another. Let's see. Let's see. Okay. 1 second. Okay, now we'll talk about the idea of contradiction. Okay, and this is one of the bigger ones. This is one of the major ones. With style, sometimes you can say, oh, like I vary my style. I will use one turn of phrase in one paragraph, another turn of phrase in another paragraph. How do you know, that is that implies a different author, a different speaker? Well, you don't. I will never make such a deduction based on one reason only, based on the appearance of just Elohim in a particular verse and nothing else. There has to be other reasons for me to attribute a particular verse, a particular story, a particular excerpt to a particular author. And one major way is that there are plenty of contradictions in the biblical text. So I start this off because my primary audience here, I think I was told by my consultants, is moderate Christians. You'll find a lot of the way I relate to the way I'm talking is with that kind of audience in mind. Here, your pastor or rabbi may have told you at some point that the reason you were finding inconsistencies and contradictions in the Bible because you weren't trying hard enough to make sense of what it said. And I have heard that. I have heard those kinds of those kinds of words. And I went to religious schooling as a child up till the age 18. It did. I wasn't happy with that reason, and it's part of the reason I went into academia. As I've talked about, but it's like it's the fault is with me. It's like I can't. I'm not trying hard enough to make sense. But that's asking a lot of people. If it doesn't make sense to a reasonably intelligent reader, it's because there's a contradiction over there. So yeah, so the way a rabbi, a religious person, would justify this, there can't be contradictions in the Bible because God wrote it and God doesn't contradict himself. So I like one of the functions of this book is to validate people's initial perceptions. God didn't write the Bible; human beings did. They are fallible. So many human beings actually. So, for example, the life of Moses. So this is something I'm going to talk about right before Passover as well. My next book talk is specifically when we relate to the Exodus. There are many contradictions there. So in Exodus 3 and 4, Moses is a hesitant shuffler. You wouldn't hire to babysit. But in Exodus 14, he leads the Israelites across the sea with a wave of his arm. in Exodus 12, there are more than 600,000 young Israelite warriors, but in Exodus 15, there are 70 date trees. That's like trying to feed the residents of New York with 10 loaves of bread. That's all. They go into the desert. They go to an oasis with 70 date trees and 12 small streams. They expect to feed a population of 3 million. That doesn't make any sense. So either there's a contradiction in what is perceived to be the population of the Israelites, or the author was really out of touch. In another place, in Exodus 14:5, there's an implication that the Israelites escaped Egypt, but in another version, Pharaoh sent them away. So you have all these contradictions in the story of Moses. So this is where this is my bread and butter, is try to look at these contradictions and say, okay, based on this, what is the original version? So over here, just with regard to Moses, it seems that Moses is originally a very a heroic hero. He's not hesitant. He leads the Israelites through, strikes the Egyptians with plagues, leads the Israelites through the sea and into the promised land. And there, in reality, much fewer Israelites, much fewer people that left Egypt. Only a few thousand people, not 3 million people. And in reality, the Israelites did escape Egypt. Pharaoh didn't send them away. So you have to make determinations of like what version came earlier, what version came later, and what would the reasons be for adding those particular that particular text. Okay, so that's with regard to Moses. But these kinds of discrepancies, contradictions, you find all over the 5 books of Moses, all over the Torah, not just in the story of Moses, but elsewhere. And that's really, I would say, the most important of the criteria to, in determining who wrote what. So I wanted, finally, after we've talked about some of the ways in which a Bible critic works, I want to talk about the story, the most important story that's in the title. Why did Abraham murder Isaac? So I want to start with Genesis 22, and then which is the story of the sacrifice, and then move afterwards to Genesis 20, which is the why. And when I say the story, I don't mean just the story, the title of my book. The story of the sacrifice of Isaac is the most important story in the Hebrew Bible, bar none. There's no story that is more important than that in the history of monotheistic religions. It heavily informed the story of the Passion of Jesus Christ, this literary form, and it appears in a different version in the Quran. There in the Quran, it doesn't talk about which son is the one Abraham is intending to offer. Later, Muslim commentators identify that son with Ishmael. But Abraham, the fact that one of the sons is saved is a reason for a big most important holiday, Eid al-Adha in Islam. So it really is is a story that has a lot of resonance. And those are just like the important, I just brought the 3 different religious traditions over there, but it's just like retold in multiple times in rabbinic Judaism and in many other forums. And so it's just it really is the story that is resonant. So that's part of the reason that I want to talk about it. The other is there's an enduring mystery to this story. And it's a question that's occupied commentators and philosophers, Kierkegaard, Derrida, to this very day. And that's the why. Why would God, what's the logic behind God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son? There has to be a logic behind it. A common way of looking at it among atheists is to say, oh, well, we're talking about a capricious deity. He'll do whatever, he's bloodthirsty. This is what he'll do. But no, that's a kind of like a go-to answer for us, and it's not a good answer. There's a coherence to this story. It's not arbitrary. There's not arbitrariness and capriciousness over here. There are reasons for actions. There's a logical background to why God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son. So, and that's an enduring mystery. People have written books, tens and hundreds of thousands of pages have been written about this question. It's not something that I take lightly. So I would say, it takes a bit of hubris to actually say, yes, I have the answer, but that's part of being bombastic, with my claims. Yes, I do believe I have the answer, at least the first answer that is for the why. Afterwards, there's many other answers are offered, depending on where you come from religiously or philosophically. But mine is the first why. And that makes it has priority. It makes it important. So Genesis 22, for all its great, for all its central status, is the most important story in the Hebrew Bible, is actually a very short chapter. It only has like 19 verses, or 19 verses that are part of the story. Then there's an addendum to it afterwards, but the story itself is only 19 verses long. And the problem, there are a couple of problems with this story. So in verse 1 it says, take your son, your only son whom you love, even Isaac, and go into the land of Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you of. That's God speaking to Abraham. So he's telling him to sacrifice his son. And then I'm going to skip right away to verse 19. So give me a second, I'll bring it up. In verse 19 it says, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba. Abraham lived in Beersheba. So it starts off with God commanding Abraham to take his son to the land of Moriah to sacrifice him. And then when Abraham and then at the end of the story, Abraham returned. And so the question that's always been asked is, where has Isaac disappeared to? What wasn't he supposed to be together with Abraham at that point? We know that Isaac, according to this to Genesis 22, survived. But in verse 19 it says that Abraham returned alone. And so this verse is the most critical verse, and it's a verse that has inspired different readings of the story. So there are a lot of people that, based on this verse, completely retold the story as if Abraham actually murdered his son. Whereas what it actually says is this. In verse 11 it says, Yahweh's angel called to Abraham out of the sky and said, Abraham, Abraham. Don't lay your hand on the boy. Don't do anything to him, for I now know that you fear God. Abraham lifted his eyes, looked, and saw that behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering instead of his son. So we see that Isaac is saved in the original version. Yet, why is Abraham returning alone then? And this is especially important because in parts of the story, it emphasizes that they went together. Abraham and Isaac went together. They both went together in verse 6. So they both went together in verse 8. So it's a very big mystery why it says that Abraham returned alone. It kind of, if you look at rabbinic retellings of the story, it implies that Abraham, that Abraham actually sacrificed his son. If you look at the most important story in the New Testament, the Passion of Christ, that was deeply influenced by this. Also, the son is sacrificed. The son dies on the cross, and so it's a version of the story that endures. It's a version of the story that the idea that Abraham actually sacrificed his son is very central. And there's always, there continues to be versions of the story circulating for years in retellings, and it just seems to side by side with the story that Abraham's son was saved, Isaac was saved. There seems to be this story that Isaac was sacrificed. So what happened over here in this story? Why am I belaboring the point over here that there was this version where Abraham sacrificed his son? Why is it important? There's a more important question actually. The more important question is the question is not verse 19 where Abraham returned to his young men alone. It's why verse 2? Why did God command Abraham to sacrifice his son in the first place? So the actual outcome might be a little less important. The outcome of whether in this story Isaac is sacrificed or not sacrificed might be not as important as the why. Why is God asking Abraham to sacrifice a child? The reason I am belaboring the point is, is that it's a vastly different outcome. If the son, if Isaac is, is sacrificed or not, meaning in one case, in one case, there's a murder that goes on, a murder commanded by God, and that says something about the way God is viewed in that time period, and in another, God is testing in some way, ultimately saves the divinity, ultimately saves the son, ultimately saves saves Isaac, and is and in that way there's not, at least the mystery of God commanding the sacrifice of a human being and then following through is not there. There's the added mystery, why would God test Abraham? That's a different sort of question. So you end up asking, depending on the version of the story, you end up asking different questions. Okay, so that's our first stop on this journey. I didn't really go into the nuts and bolts over here. You can tell a little bit of how I do it is you can tell the different fonts over here are the different in the italics are the original version, and if you look at the story that I've isolated over here, the full story. Let's just read it out. So this is the story of God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham following through with it. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. He said, now take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, go down to the land of Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you of. Abraham rose in the early morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went to the place which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes, saw the place far off. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go yonder. We will worship and come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took it in his hand, the fire. He took in his hand the fire and the knife. They both went together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father, he said. Here I am, my son. He said, Here's the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they both went together. They came to the place of which God had told him. Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son, and he killed his son. God's angel called to him out of the sky and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. The angel, said, now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose up, and they went to Beersheba. Abraham lived in Beersheba. Now, the reason I read this out was to show you, Shirley had this question, where did you see this earlier version of this story? So the way everything that I've read here is from the biblical text. I just isolated it from the original, from the today's version of chapter 22. This is the original version of chapter 22, and in this original version, there's no inconsistency. There's no, the name of God is consistent. It's God, Elohim, and not Yahweh. There's no inconsistency about whether Abraham killed his son or did not kill his son. Abraham killed his son, but in isolation, and a lot of people look at this story in isolation. The central question is, why did God command this? And for that, and this is the final portion of this lecture. We have to go back to the very beginning, and the very beginning is not the story of Genesis, with the creation of the world. The very beginning is the story, is Abraham's story. That's where the Hebrew Bible started. The original version of the Hebrew Bible started. So the story begins in Genesis 20. Abraham the wanderer arrives in Gerar with his beautiful wife, Sarah. And this is indeed a beginning. It's also the beginning. It's the first time Eve, who is the original author, first author of the 5 books of Moses, it's ground zero of the biblical story, appears on the scene. How do I know that this is the first story? Well, for starters, the source uses the name Elohim for the deity, which I translate as God. Most of the other Abraham stories use the name Yahweh. This source focuses on the fear of God as a theme, and it is an extraordinarily terse storyteller, as you can see from these first verses. So here we start reading. Abraham traveled toward the land of the south and lived between Kadesh and Shur. He lived as a foreigner in Gerar. Abraham said about Sarah his wife, she is my sister. Avimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Avimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. So here the story moves very fast. An important point to make is that in biblical Hebrew, taking a woman means sexually taking a woman, meaning the implication in this text is that Avimelech, the king of Gerar, had sexual relations with Sarah, and for that reason, verse 3 makes entire sense. God says to Avimelech, you are a dead man because this woman is another person's wife. Seems a very fraught situation. But verse 3, but there is something intervening. This idea that Sarah could have had sexual relations with a man that wasn't Abraham is very, very disturbing to this author, to a later author, and this later author tries to mitigate this. Tries to, this is and what does he say? Avimelech had not really come near her. Like, even though it says he took her, he didn't really come near her. He said, Lord, will you kill a righteous nation? Didn't he tell me she's my sister? Etc. God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that. In the integrity of your heart, you have done this. And I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I didn't allow you to touch her. There's a lot of emphasis here that Avimelech and Sarah did not have sexual relations. So, what's weird about this? about this section and why I have it in a different font is this is not the kind of thing that happens in biblical stories. There's no dream dialogues in biblical stories. This type of dream dialogue is one of a kind. And when you see something that's one of a kind, as a Bible critic, you immediately suspect it as something that was inserted later. And why would it have been inserted later? Is the reason here is very, very obvious. The reason here is because to make sure that we think that Avimelech did not have sexual relations with Sarah. And why do we want Avimelech not to have sexual relations with Sarah? Well, that is because of chapter 21. In chapter 21, Isaac is born. And if Avimelech had sexual relations with Sarah, that might mean that Avimelech was actually Isaac's father. And that would not be good for the story. That would not work well with our patriarchal lineage of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Then we would have a bastard in the middle. And so we have to make sure, this editor wanted us to know there's no chance in hell that that Avimelech had sexual relations with Sarah. But that's not. But if you isolate the story, the original version of the story, that's not how it worked. Avimelech did have sexual relations with Sarah, and so this is how it read. This is how the dream actually went. Avimelech didn't actually participate at all. God came to Avimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. If you don't restore her, know for sure that you will die, you and all who are yours." Okay, so that makes this more direct. There's no Avimelech doesn't and that's a very normal dream in the biblical literature. The God comes into a dream and tells the hero, warns the hero against something happening. That is very normal. The dialogue is very abnormal. So, of course, what happens over here is Avimelech is very, very afraid. He in verse 8 it says, Avimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told all these things in their ear. The men were very afraid. It's not, anybody would be afraid if God had just threatened to kill them, and everything that belonged to them as well. And so here, this is a point where at this time we look at the idea of the fear of God. For the original Bible, for the original source, the fear of God was the most overriding principle that existed. If fearing God, if you did not fear God, you deserve to die. If you did fear God, all was good. That overrode all morality, anything else. So over here, we can see that the king Avimelech is very fearful. He fears God, and he tries to mitigate the problem. Afterwards, Avimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you have done this thing?" Abraham said, "Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place. They will kill me for my wife's sake." And of course, he was wrong. They didn't kill him, and they actually, God actually protected him. Then we come to the end. Avimelech actually rewards Abraham. Avimelech said, "Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you." So, but more important over here is the concept of the fear of God. It's clear Abraham doesn't trust in God to protect him. He lies. He presents Sarah as his wife. Sarah suffers for it. She has sexual relations, presumably against her will, with Avimelech, but Avimelech seems to fear God quite a bit. So this is not a situation that can stand. The result of this situation is chapter 21, in which a son is born to Sarah, and we don't know who the father is in this original version. We don't know if it's Avimelech or Abraham. We can have our suspicions that it's Avimelech. There's a lot of emphasis in chapter 21, which I won't review with you for matters of time, that on this paternity. It repeats itself 6 or 7 times. Abraham was the father, Abraham was the father, Abraham was the father. To make sure that that's drilled in, Abraham was the father. But in this original version, it's not true. So what is so here is the why for Abraham, for God's command to Abraham. It's the most brutal literary justice. Abraham did not trust God to protect him. That is the worst and cardinal sin for this original Bible. The way Abraham can rectify it is to show a much higher level of trust. And the way he shows his trust is to sacrifice his son. Now, it also has that added layer of, well, that also takes care of the problem of bastardhood. Even now the son, who we're not sure whether he was Abraham's son or not, gets sacrificed. So that's not a deep philosophical answer. That's not, it's a really brutal, direct, poetic justice answer. But that is the original reason of why Abraham was commanded to kill Isaac and why he ultimately does kill Isaac. It also kind of solves Abraham's problem. There is no longer a child that might be his own or might be someone else's. Okay, so now that's why Abraham killed Isaac. That's the title of my book. That's the original reason that's offered for Abraham killing Isaac. Afterwards, as I said, philosophers, commentators offer all kinds of justifications for it. This is the first and original reason, and the impetus for me writing the book. So.